Welcome back, everyone. It's been, well, 3 years since this whole thing started. And with a new president, things are, well, they're definitely interesting, to say the least. We're diving back into the war in Ukraine today.
Yeah, it looks like you've pulled together a lot of different sources this time. We've got, let's see, news from Poland, the US, even Russia, and there's that one analytical piece from the UK. Should be an interesting mix of perspectives.
Exactly. We were trying to figure out, is there any chance for peace this year? Especially because, that whole thing about Trump ending the war quickly, that's not exactly how it's panned out, is it?
Right, right. Let's jump into it, see what these sources tell us.
So one thing that really stood out to me right off the bat was Trump's, well, his whole tone. He's gone from, promising a quick resolution to this super aggressive stance towards Russia. He even said Putin's destroying Russia.
Yeah, definitely a change from the whole campaign vibe for sure. And you can see that new aggressive stance in his Truth Social. Remember that post? Threatening all those high taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on Russia if they don't agree to peace.
Oh yeah, that if we don't make a deal, I'm going to tax the hell out of them.
Yeah.
Line. Doesn't really sound like the master negotiator everyone was expecting, does he?
Not really. And it's not just Russia in the crosshairs. He's been going after the European allies, too. Says they're not doing enough to help Ukraine. Called their contributions ridiculous compared to what the U.S. is doing.
Yeah, I remember that. Something like Europe needs to step up. They're not paying their fair share. But the Russian sources, they don't really seem too bothered by all this tough talk.
They're basically brushing it off as, empty threats. They've had sanctions for a while now, and they think they can handle whatever else comes their way. Plus, they're saying their military operation is going well. They control, almost 20% of Ukraine now, and they're pushing forward in Donbass, slowly but surely.
Yeah, one analyst even said they're in a position to maintain their demands. Sounds pretty confident, like they think they'll win eventually. Not exactly the attitude of someone ready to make a deal, huh?
Doesn't sound like it.
Yeah.
And while Trump has said he wants to meet with Putin, well, nothing concrete's come of that yet. Plus, it doesn't seem like people are too convinced he can actually pull it off.
There was that poll, I think it was in the UK, showed almost no one thinks Trump can end this thing quickly.
Right, right. And when you look at it all, it's a mess, really. Russia doesn't want to give up any land. Ukraine wants solid security guarantees. Nobody really trusts each other. Peace talks seem like a long shot right now.
Especially with both sides thinking Trump's, well, unpredictable and unreliable.
Exactly. That's not exactly a recipe for smooth negotiations. And then there's the whole question of what happens after the war. How do you make sure Ukraine is safe?
We've got an article here that lays out a few options they're thinking about. NATO membership, international peacekeeping forces, and then there's this Israeli model thing.
The Israeli model, it's basically having a really strong military so no one messes with you, even if you're not part of a big alliance.
Each option's got its own problems, though, right?
Big time. NATO's probably a no-go. The US and Russia both don't want that. Peacekeeping would be a logistical nightmare. Plus, Russia would probably fight it tooth and nail.
And with the Israeli model, well, Ukraine's dealing with a much bigger, badder enemy than Israel ever had to.
It's a tough situation, no easy answers.
Yeah.
And then you've got that one source saying what we really need is a whole new system for security in Europe.
They're saying that if we don't deal with Russia's, their deep-seated fears and anxieties and all that, there's never going to be lasting peace. Pretty thought-provoking, isn't it?
For sure. Especially when you consider that Russia actually suggested something like that, a treaty, before the war even started. And the U.S. said no.
Makes you wonder, did we miss a chance to stop this whole thing? Could we have done things differently?
Those are some heavy questions. But before we get too deep into the what-ifs, let's take a closer look at what's happening on the ground right now. So even though they've had some setbacks, even with, a ton of casualties, Russia's still making headway in Donbass. They're pushing west, putting pressure on some of those key Ukrainian supply lines.
You said earlier that they've gotten used to the sanctions. How are they doing that?
Well, they've kind of turned inward, focusing on their own markets. And they've made some new deals with countries like China and India. Plus, with energy prices going up globally, that's actually helped them out. Oh, and their military. They're actually learning and getting better, changing up their tactics and all that.
It's hard to believe they're not giving up. I mean, 1 million casualties. It's just insane.
They're tough. Got to give them that. Their economy's hanging in there better than a lot of people thought it would. And they seem dead set on getting what they want, no matter what it takes.
And what they want hasn't changed since this whole thing started.
Nope. They still want those areas they took to be recognized as theirs. officially. They want guarantees that Ukraine won't join NATO, that it will stay neutral. And they want Ukraine to basically disarm, get rid of most of their military.
So they want to make Ukraine a buffer state, basically.
Yeah.
Control it without actually controlling it. Doesn't that feel kind of old school? Like spheres of influence and buffer zones. It's like we're back in the 1800s or something.
A lot of analysts have been saying that, yeah. It makes you wonder if Trump really gets it, All the history behind this, the long game. He seems to be all over the place, tough talk 1 minute, promising a quick deal the next. Hard to see what his plan is.
And his whole America First thing hasn't exactly made our allies in Europe jump to help. They're not exactly thrilled about spending more on their militaries, even though Trump's been all over them about it.
He does have a point, though. We've been footing most of the bill for this whole thing. But can he really make them cough up more cash, especially when they've got their own economic issues to deal with?
It's a tough sell, that's for sure, especially with Trump. I mean, let's be honest. He doesn't exactly have a reputation for being reliable, does he?
Right. They're not sure what he's going to do next, and they don't trust him.
So with all that in mind, what do you think? Is peace even possible this year?
I don't know. It's hard to be hopeful. Russia's feeling pretty good about themselves right now. They're not going to back down easily. And Ukraine. They're fighting like hell, but they're running out of steam.
And Trump. Well, he's Trump, right? You never know what he's going to do. He seems more interested in making deals than in, thinking about the big picture.
Which is a scary thought, especially when you're talking about a country like Russia. They've got nukes, remember?
So what do we do? What's next?
First things first, we've got to face reality. Russia's doing pretty well, both militarily and with their economy. They're not going anywhere.
What about Ukraine?
They need help, and they need it now. Weapons, money, the whole 9 yards. And they need the rest of the world to have their back, to show them they're not on their own. But they also need to be realistic. Going back to how things were before the war, that's probably not going to happen.
So both sides have to compromise, give up something.
Exactly. And that's the hard part, right? Figuring out how to make Russia feel safe without screwing Ukraine over, without taking away their freedom.
Sounds impossible.
It's a tall order, yeah. But hey, history's full of stories where people manage to end wars that seem like they'd never end. You need the will to do it and some smart diplomacy.
We haven't really talked about the people caught in the middle of all this. What about the Ukrainians? What are they going through?
More than anything, they want this war to be over. They've been through hell and back, but they're still fighting, still hoping. It's amazing, really, how strong they are.
Being strong isn't going to win this war, though.
No, they need help from the outside. They need the West to step up and give them what they need. And they need the world to show them that we're not going to abandon them.
But like we were talking about earlier, that's not exactly a sure thing, is it?
Nope. And the longer this goes on, the more likely it is that people will start to get tired of it. The governments, the people, everyone.
So what could that mean? A deal that's good for Russia, but bad for Ukraine?
It's definitely a possibility. That's why we can't let up the pressure. We've got to make sure Ukraine can defend itself and that Russia knows there'll be a price to pay for what they're doing.
But we don't want things to get even worse, right? We don't want this to turn into a bigger war.
It's a tightrope walk, that's for sure. It's a tough situation. No easy answers. But we can't just sit back and do nothing. What happens to Ukraine matters. It matters to all of Europe. To the whole world, really.
So we've got a Russia that's feeling pretty good about themselves, a Ukraine that's struggling, a Europe that can't seem to get its act together, and a president who, well, who knows what he'll do next. Doesn't sound too good, does it?
It's a powder keg, that's for sure. And nobody knows how it's going to blow.
This is going to be a long, hard road, isn't it?
It is. What happens next is going to affect everything. This is a big one, a real turning point.
We've talked a lot today. But the question's still there, isn't it? What's going to happen? How's this all going to end?
Let's take a look at some of the ways this could play out, see if we can get a handle on what the future might hold.
So we've talked about, where the war's at right now, Trump's, his style, and all the problems Ukraine and, the whole world are facing.
Mm-hmm.
But what now? What could happen next? What are the possible endings to this whole thing?
Well, one scenario, and it's probably the best case scenario, is that they manage to negotiate some kind of peace deal.
A peace deal? What would that even look like?
Probably a lot of compromises on both sides. Russia's winning, at least for now, so they're going to want those areas they grabbed to be, officially recognized. And in exchange, Ukraine's going to want some serious security guarantees.
But that's the tough part, right? Like we talked about before, NATO's not happening. And peacekeeping's a mess.
Exactly. So we're talking about something where Ukraine says they'll stay neutral and maybe countries like the US and China step into promise to protect them. But even then, there's the whole trust issue.
Yeah. After what happened with Crimea, how can Ukraine trust Russia to keep their word? Didn't they have that agreement before, the Budapest Memorandum or something?
Right, right. Any deal would have to be ironclad, super specific about what happens if someone breaks it. It'd be a tough balancing act for sure.
And for the Ukrainians, even if they get the best deal possible, it's still going to be hard to accept. Losing all that land after everything they've been through, that's got to be tough.
No doubt about it. But sometimes you got to pick the least bad option. A negotiated peace, even if it's not perfect, might be the only way to stop this from turning into something even worse. It's a trade-off, a choice between two really bad options.
So that's one way it could go, a peace deal that nobody's really happy with. What else could happen?
Another possibility, and this one's a lot scarier, is that it turns into a frozen conflict.
Frozen conflict? What's that mean?
Basically, the fighting keeps going, but it's lower level. Neither side wins, nobody backs down. It just becomes this stalemate, this constant tension that could explode at any moment.
So a constant threat hanging over everyone, never really knowing when things are going to go bad again.
Exactly. It would keep the whole region unstable, always on edge, always worried about things escalating. Plus, the humanitarian crisis, all the suffering, that would just keep going. For years, maybe even decades, it would be a drain on everyone, a constant source of stress.
And what about Ukraine? What happens to them in that scenario?
They'd be a divided country, basically. With Russia controlling a big chunk of their land, their economy would be in shambles, their people would be traumatized, and their future would be totally uncertain. It would be a tragedy, really.
And Russia, what happens to them?
They'd probably keep getting hit with sanctions, but like we've seen, they can handle that. They've adapted. And in a way, a frozen conflict might actually work in their favor. It keeps Ukraine weak and unstable, which is what they want, strategically speaking.
So basically, a frozen conflict is a lose-lose situation for everyone, except maybe for the people running things in Russia.
Yeah, it's a bleak outlook, but that's the reality of it. Frozen conflicts almost never benefit anyone in the long run, except for those who profit from chaos.
Okay, so we've got a shaky peace deal, a frozen conflict.
Yeah.
Anything else we need to think about?
Well, there's always the chance that things could get even worse. A miscalculation, someone does something stupid, an axe, and any of that could spiral out of control and turn this into a full-blown war. And that could pull NATO in too.
Now that's scary. A war between Russia and the West. With all those nukes, that could be the end of everything. We can't just pretend that's not a possibility.
Absolutely. The stakes are incredibly high. We're talking about potential consequences that are almost impossible to comprehend. It's a sobering reminder of how fragile peace is, how important it is to handle things carefully.
So after looking at all these different scenarios, what's the takeaway for our listeners? What have we learned today?
The big lesson here is that nobody knows what's going to happen. But the decisions that get made right now, those are going to determine the future. For Ukraine, for Europe, maybe even for the whole world. We're at a turning point, and the path we choose is going to have huge consequences.
And like we've seen, there are no easy choices, no guarantees that things will turn out okay.
It's complicated and it's dangerous, but it's important to stay informed, to talk about these things, even when they're hard to talk about, and to think about the long term, about what our actions are going to lead to.
Well said. This has been a pretty intense conversation. Thanks for walking us through all of this.
My pleasure. Until next time, stay curious, keep asking questions, and let's hope for the best.